All right, welcome everyone. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Kelsey Erickson Streufert. I'm the Chief Public Affairs Officer for the Texas Restaurant Association. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a topic that I know is of interest to so many of you. It's not something we're used to dealing with a lot in Texas, and that's the labor movement. We've got a couple experts here to really fill us in on what's happening nationwide and what you as a business operator need to know to make sure that you are being a good employer and remaining in compliance with all of the pretty complicated laws that exist around this topic. So before we dive into the content, just a couple housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar. We will be sharing it on our YouTube page. So if you missed something or want to share it with someone else, please feel free to do that. Also, please engage along with us. This webinar is really for you, and you will get a lot more out of it if you are engaged with us. So please submit questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'm joined by my colleague, Haley. We'll be making sure that we get to as many of those questions as we possibly have time for. So with that, again, thank you for joining us. And I want to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. Thank you both for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Franklin, tell us who you are, how you got pulled into this mess, and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Franklin Coley with Align Public Strategies. I have sort of a political background. Started in politics, worked 3 presidentials, bunch of campaigns, eventually found my way up to DC. I was a presidential appointee in the Department of Labor under George W. Bush. Went from there to the US Senate and eventually found my way into doing public affairs work for companies, nonprofits, trade groups, and have been doing that for over 15 years with the same group of folks at Align Public Strategies. We have a little bit of a niche in the entry-level employer space and restaurants in particular.
Awesome. And you're coming to us from Florida today, is that right?
The free state of Florida. Yes, we are. That's where we base out of. But we, like Texas and even Oklahoma, where Phil is, we all have Starbucks organizing campaigns going on in our states. So it's interesting days.
Absolutely. Thanks, Franklin. All right, Phil.
I'm Phil Wilson, and I'm the president and chief bottle washer at Labor Relations Institute. We're a management side labor and positive employee relations consulting firm based in I'm here at the world headquarters in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, but not too far from the great state of Texas.
Perfect. All right, Franklin, I think you're kicking us off with the presentation.
Sure, and I'll kind of frame things up and just talk about what's going on, what's the state of play, and obviously that's going to be talking a lot about Starbucks, but this all started before Starbucks and will continue after Starbucks and impact a lot of restaurateurs and retailers beyond the Starbucks brand. And then once I kind of level set on the state of play and what's going on, I'll hand over to Phil for the actual important stuff, which is what you need to be doing within your 4 walls to prepare for this. And so I'll try to kind of buzz through this pretty quickly. So if you have any questions or want me to dig deeper into anything, just throw the questions in the chat and we'll pick those up as we go along or stop and do a little deeper dive.
Hey, Franklin, before you jump in, I forgot to do the one thing I said I was going to do.
I was going to bring that up. Okay.
Which is be my lawyer for a minute and give those disclaimers. So everything we're presenting today is general advice. We can't serve as your individual lawyer on this webinar. So just take note of that. And then this is also off the record. If any members of the press are joining us, off the record today, really just meant to provide general guidance to our restaurant members. All right, now I think we're ready to go.
As if you could just follow me around and say that before and after I say anything, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks for that. And if you could kick us maybe to the first slide. So this is kind of level setting coming out of the pandemic, where things stand. And this is just a kind of get everyone on the same page about the labor dynamics in the restaurant industry right now and really in the broader economy. So, during the pandemic, we had a a lot of employers let go workers or cut back hours. They were forced to, and there's a broken trust between a lot of employers and a lot of employees. At the same time, we had all these differing mandates. An employee may come in on a Tuesday and there was a mask requirement, and then come back in on Thursday, there was no mask requirement. And, a lot of that was being set by the federal government or the state government or local governments. Maybe not as much in Florida and Texas, but certainly in other parts of the country. And a lot of that wasn't trickling down to the frontline employee. So the employee on any given day would show up and not know what the policies were, where they were coming from, and felt like they had no input into the process. What they didn't have a lot of insight into a lot of the times is employers oftentimes didn't have a lot of input into that process either. But for the frontline employee that had legitimate health and safety concerns, particularly early on in the pandemic, when we didn't know what this thing was or how it was transmitted, it was a very volatile situation. And it made them kind of reassess their relationship with their employer and reassess the value of their work. And so coming out of the pandemic, we have these kind of feelings in the workforce, and we have at the exact same time unprecedented worker leverage. And an employee could leave working in one restaurant and walk across the street and get a job that same day, that same hour, probably for more pay, right? And so it was a dynamic where, workers were emboldened. And they also had, there were all these kind of overhang from the pandemic. You combine that with a younger generation, Gen Z, even millennials, that have just different attitudes and expectations around the workplace. And so you bundle all that together and you get what we have, which is, and you can advance to the next slide, which is you start to see, it really started before the pandemic. You started to kind of see a bubble up of organizing activity. It hit overdrive during the pandemic. The first organizing campaigns were really at brew pubs, distilleries, and they were in very specific metros like, Minneapolis and Milwaukee and Chicago and, greater Boston and, the Portlands and the Seattles. But you would see these organizing campaigns in these brew pubs, distilleries, where they were focused on issues related to the pandemic, like right to recall. So that was a requirement that employers have to essentially pick back up their workers. You saw a lot of these demands around health and safety protections related to COVID. And you saw a lot of employee organizing campaigns focused on scheduling as well. And we all know what a nightmare it was during COVID, during the pandemic, but also now with these stretched labor forces in terms of keeping employees in, and scheduling is a symptom of having a stretched workforce and, having to close down one day and reopen the next day. You get where you're calling people last minute to come in and fill shifts. All those things baked into a bunch of organizing campaigns, many of which were successful, that kind of flew under the radar because they were small, independent coffee shops, maybe one or two locations in a particular market. And it really didn't bubble up. We were watching it and we were talking about it, but it didn't hit the national consciousness. And we knew it was a matter of time. And of course, that's what happened. It kind of jumped into a big chain, Starbucks, and it happened first in those metro areas where we had these organizing campaigns at other independent coffee shops, started in Buffalo and then Boston. And so you had workers at Spot Coffee that had been successful organizing that went over and organized Starbucks. And you've seen that in a lot of the first metros and even some of these latter metros where these independent coffee shop campaigns spilled right over into Starbucks and picked up. And that kind of set off a national movement. So if you want to advance to the next slide. Then it became cool. And so now organizing is a national thing. So going back to our first slide, you've got Gen Z workers that spend their entire life on these social channels. Their networks are built through these social channels. They're as close to, Bernie Sanders supporters in Portland as they may be, someone down the street via their social networks, right? And so that's really what kind of hit overdrive in this campaign. This ran July 13th in Vogue the magazine. These are your workers from Texas that organized the first, that's my Florida thunderstorm right there, if you could hear that. They organized the first Starbucks union in Texas. This is where things have really taken off, is, it has become kind of the cool thing to do. So last slide for me, if you would advance. So I joined a webinar, snuck into a webinar with a longtime SEIU president who called this the first internet campaign. And that's really how we've seen this take off, kind of online through social media. And so it's led to what he called 1,000 blooming flowers, to use his language. And so that's how you've seen, Phil, when he historically would help employers navigate this, you would look for union activity kind of one city block at a time, right? Like if there's a union down the street at the auto plant, a half a mile down the street, and the UAWs they're organizing, then you're probably going to be next in the, they're organizing by metro block in a pretty systematic way. That's not what's happening here. This is skipping across the country, across these different networks. And so you get organizing efforts popping up in the middle of Florida, in the middle of Oklahoma, and in the middle of Texas. So this map I will drop into the chat. I stole this from More Perfect Union, which is a union back group, a labor back group that's tracking the Starbucks organizing campaigns. These are the campaigns that are ongoing. Some of these have organized in a union. You have 4 Starbucks unionized locations in Texas right now. Some of these are in the process of organizing. That More Perfect Union link is a good way to keep track of the epicenters of organizing. If you are down the street from a San Antonio Starbucks that is organizing, you need to be on your A game, because those workers, and particularly if you're in the coffee segment, the closer you are to this workforce, let me just summarize things in a politically incorrect way. If you have a workforce, that has an upturned mustache, right? Like, you need to be worried that your workers are interacting with these Starbucks workers, and the closer in proximity you are, you need to be talking to Phil, paying attention to what he's getting ready to go through, because they're definitely union organizers talking to your workers. So the independents, coffees in particular, but high end. We had a petition at a sushi restaurant recently, which took right out of the Starbucks playbook. If you're in that kind of independent top tier, you're separating on price and benefits and other things, you need to be looking out, because this could be coming your way and you could be the next one in the press. So with that, unless there's any quick questions and background, I'm going to hand it off to Phil to get to the kind of the meat of things here. And I'm seeing no questions. Good. All right, Phil, your show.
Thanks, Franklin. I'm sure jealous of that thunderstorm you're having there. So I like just a quick level set with the process. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I do think it's important to kind of understand. So you saw the blooming flowers on the last slide. So some of those are in different parts of this process, okay? And so I think just at a high level, the way that organizing occurs is the union, first of all, has to show that they have enough support to seek recognition as the exclusive bargaining agent. I'll talk about that in a minute, but anyway, they have to show that they have enough support. This is typically done through either signing physical authorization cards. I'll show you an example of those. You can also do it electronically now, but they have to go and present, at least to the employer and ultimately to the National Labor Relations Board. They have to present this show of support. And that show of support has to be a minimum of 30% of the group that they're seeking to represent. In most restaurant cases, they seek to represent the entire restaurant. They don't have to do that. So they could split out even in smaller groups of workers. And then in the Starbucks case, there was also this argument. Starbucks has lost this argument every time that they've made it, but there's sometimes it's the argument that, look, the correct group here is not the one restaurant or one store, it's multiple stores, or like all the stores in one town. But whatever that unit is that the union is seeking, they have to show up with at least 30% support. If they have majority support, so that means 50% plus one or more cards of a group they want to represent, they can seek what's called voluntary recognition, which means just that they would go to the employer and say, hey, we want you to recognize us. And if the employer were to say yes, then the union would be in there would be no election. And without getting too deep in the weeds, the current general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board actually is trying to get the board to change the rule to where that would be the way it is normally done. So today, if an employer says, hey, wait, we want to have an election, then the union is required to go seek an election if they wish to represent a group of workers. This new rule would basically go, look, if the union shows up and they've got a majority of people signed up on cards, the employer is required to recognize that union, no vote, unless they have some specific evidence that the union's show of support is invalid for some reason. So that's a big change. That is, I would guess, going to happen before the end of the year. But either way, that's sort of this first phase of they gather the support. That's the card signing phase. Then you get to this election phase. So today, most of the cases are settled based on an election. So all of those purple dots on the map that Franklin just showed, those are places where Starbucks, a petition was filed with the NLRB, and they are either had an election already or going to have an election, but that's the second phase that you see here. And basically this is a secret ballot election. The union, again, they have to prove majority status. So that means they have to win at least 50% plus one vote to prove that they represent a majority. If it's a 50-50 tie, then they don't represent that group because they have not proven majority status. That secret ballot election historically has always been done, just like any election you've probably ever participated in, where it is done with a ballot and it goes into a box, and like that's the election. That's called a manual ballot. Today, more and more, especially in COVID impacted communities, most of the elections are being held by mail ballot. So that is where they will mail you your ballot kit, you fill it out, then you send it back. However the election is conducted, at that point, they count the ballots, and if the union has won a majority, then they become the exclusive bargaining agent, and you go to the bargaining phase. If the union doesn't prove majority status, there is no union there, and at least for the next year, that place is not represented. After a year, the union could come back and seek representation again. When you get to the bargaining status, the bargaining phase, this is something that there's a lot of mythology about it. So it's important to understand kind of the way this phase works. When a union wins an election, they do not win a contract. They don't win like a pay raise. They don't win a certain benefit. There's nothing specifically they win other than the right to negotiate a labor agreement on behalf of this particular group of workers. So that's what they win when they win an election. So once that occurs, so a lot of these Starbucks stores are now in this bargaining phase. The union has proven majority status, and now Starbucks and the union have to sit down and negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. And they can go back and forth. There's no requirement that either party has to agree to the proposals that are made by the other party. The only real requirement is that the parties have to negotiate in good faith. And good faith means that you meet at reasonable times, reasonable places in an effort to reach a collective bargaining agreement. But again, the Starbucks doesn't have to agree to anything that the union proposes, and the union doesn't have to agree to anything that Starbucks proposes. That's the way that process works. If the parties are able to reach an agreement, come up with all of the provisions and agree that, yes, this is the contract we want to enter, they then are required to sign that contract. So once they've reached agreement, the parties have to execute the contract, and then that now is the contract and work conditions that are in place for the term of that agreement, which is usually 3 years. Doesn't have to be, but it's usually 3 years. So that's the last phase that's on here, the contract phase. So that contract is binding on the entire bargaining unit. It does not matter whether you are, so Texas, for example, is a right to work state. You don't have to become a union member if you are covered by a union contract, but you are still bound by the contract, whether you're a union member or not. If you work in a workplace that has a union and there is a union contract, you are bound by the terms of that agreement. The union is also your exclusive bargaining agent. So like if you have a discipline issue or some problem with your employer, you have to go to the union to represent you, even if you're not paying them any money and even if you're not paying dues. Yet they still are the ones in charge of representing you. And of course, the union's not too excited about representing people that aren't paying them money. So that's kind of a decision that you have to make. You also, by the way, don't get to vote on your contract. So there's things you lose if you don't join, but in right to work states, you don't have to join. And then that contract, another sort of myth, like that contract is not always an improvement over what you had before the union came in. You could get more than what you have, but you could get less than what you have, or things might stay exactly the same. You are going to be asked to pay dues to the union or pay some fee to the union. And in a right to work state, you don't have to do that. But again, you're going to face a lot of pressure to do it.
Hey,
so
Phil.
Yes.
I've got a question here that's relevant. We have so much churn and turnover happening in our industry right now. What happens, or does it matter if people are leaving while the election is taking place? How does that affect the math?
Yeah, great question. So there's several impacts. So the first is that if the union is coming in, so like you're in let's say the card signing to the election phase. So one of the things you might bring up, for example, if the union shows up with a bunch of cards, but they're cards of people that don't work there anymore, that would be a reasonable thing for the employer to go, hey, wait a minute, this show of support, some of these people aren't employed here. Same thing with the election. In the election, if someone has quit and there's no expectation that they're coming back, that person is not eligible to vote in the election. Now, if you've hired somebody new, there's also a rule that the payroll cutoff happens before the petition's filed, usually. And just, I don't want to complicate it. Let's just say that's the normal cutoff. So if you got hired after the petition was filed, but before the election occurs, you don't get to vote in the election either. Even though you're employed there, even though you'll be covered by the contract if there is one, even though the union will be your representative, you don't get to vote unless you were on the payroll before the petition was filed. So anyway, but that is how that works. Now, once a union is in, let's say that the entire workplace, the entire unit turns over. So everyone who was there when the union was voted in leaves, new employees are hired. Does that mean that the union goes away? Because none of the people that voted for it are there anymore. No, is the answer. Once a union has proven exclusive status, they are presumed to maintain that status. Even if you hire new people, they are presumed to maintain that status unless there is some proof that they no longer enjoy it. And that would be, for example, like if a bunch of employees that now work there signed a document that said, we don't want to be represented by a union, that would then be proof that the union no longer enjoys majority status. But during the term of a contract, for example, these 3 years at the bottom of this page, you cannot test majority status. So those 3 years, even if everybody turned over and nobody wanted to have a union anymore, the union stays in during the term of that contract. There's only certain periods of time where they can be voted out. Did that answer your question?
It does. And then
Okay.
One other question that came in is all this the same regardless of part-time versus full-time employees?
Good one. So normally, the unit is all regular, full, and part-time employees. So generally speaking, that would be your unit. It does not include what are called 211. That's just a section of the act, but that does not include 211 supervisors. So those are management employees that have the right to hire and fire and responsibly direct the workforce. Generally, in a restaurant, there's only one 211 supervisor. It's whoever is the general manager or the manager of the location. In bigger restaurants where you might have assistant managers that do hire and do make termination decisions and things like that. They might also be supervisors under the Act. Those folks are excluded from protection of the Act, basically, is the way that they've termed it. But anyway, they're excluded from bargaining units. But everyone else is basically a employee under the law, which means that they have the rights under Section 7 to organize. They also have a right to refrain from organizing, but that's kind of who's covered. All right. So let's move on. So that first phase is the card signing phase. And the way that you get to the show of support is by you turn in these what are called authorization cards. So this is an example one for the food and commercial workers. That's a typical union that organizes restaurants. The SEIU, Workers United, which is a part of the SEIU, Service Employees International Union, that is who's organizing the Starbucks stores. But your store could be organized by any union. But this is an example of a food and commercial workers card. They ask for a lot of private information. This one you can see asks for your social security number. It asks for specific information about like what time you work and what shifts you work. Are you full or part-time? That information all becomes property of the union. They are allowed to use it however they want to. They may sometimes share it even with other like political organizations. The DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, are behind a lot of the Starbucks organizing activity. And so you can see sometimes where people that are either involved in like DSA activity will then try to organize, but you can see it work the other way as well. You get involved in a campaign and then you're asked to go, stump for another, political candidate, for example. But these cards are legal documents. Like I said before, you don't even necessarily get a chance to vote on. Once you've signed this, you have made the legal statement that you wish to be represented by a union. And this can also be done electronically. So a lot of times it's on a website, and sometimes people get confused as to like what they're actually signing and what they mean. So one of the things that is really important for everybody that's on here is to make sure that you understand that these cards are legal documents, that people should be careful to sign them. It's not like signing up for Netflix to binge for your favorite show for a month, and then I'm going to cancel the subscription next month. You don't get that opportunity. Once you sign, you're in, and you're going to stay in. So that's important for people to know.
And Phil, is that something, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, but is that something employers can talk to their employees about?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we make sure that people seeing these understand what they're being asked to sign?
Yeah. Each individual employer, needs to kind of decide where, how much and how quickly and when they want to communicate it. But this is not common knowledge. Unions only represent about 6% of private sector workers. So most people don't even know anyone who's in a union or been in a union. And there's a lot of kind of mythology about how it all works. It's also not in the like if I'm trying to organize you, it's not in my best interest as an organizer to kind of tell you all this. I'm going to probably make this seem like a real low cost, no big deal thing to do when you sign this document, right? Oftentimes people are just told like, hey, this is a way to get more information. Sometimes they're even told like, look, like for me to get reimbursed for the beer I'm buying you, I got to turn in some proof that I talked to you. So can you sign this thing to let them know? Like there's a lot of sort of tricks of the trade to get these things signed. So yeah, an employer really should educate employees about what these are. Look, everybody has a protected right to organize a union. The point of educating people about this is, look, before you sign one of these and sign up for something, you should make sure you understand like how it all works, and make sure that you really want to be represented and have these folks speak on your behalf and not deal directly with the employer, and that you want to turn all that over to them. Because if you don't, then don't sign it. You make sure that you understand all the ins and outs. It's like renting an apartment, but you don't get to see it until after you sign the lease, right? You need to really make sure you get a tour, Does all the plumbing work? Is it in a good part of town before you sign? So that's what you want to educate people about.
And I'd pipe in there too and say, it probably never was a good strategy to wait until a bunch of authorization cards signed up and then start, having conversations. That's probably always a bad strategy. But in this day and age where the NLRB is compressing the time frame of votes, is reducing the amount of arguments and appeals that an employer can make early on and during the process, you need to have someone like Phil own call, own standby, and potentially doing this stuff ahead of anything happening within your restaurant. But certainly having their phone number ready whenever you see something like this in the trash can in the bathroom, or you see organizers talking to your employees. So it's more imperative than ever to be proactive on this stuff. Whereas 5 years ago, or certainly 15 years ago, you could be a little more lackadaisical about it. Now is not the time to do that. And I know Phil's going to, I think, talk about that in some of the coming slides, but I wanted to say that now.
Yeah, and let me jump in with a couple quick questions specifically on this topic of these cards. One, are they circulated in other languages like Spanish? I'm guessing the answer is yes, but
yeah, of course. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You pick the language. If you pick the language, they have cards in that language.
And then do employees who are under the age of 18, can they sign these, or do all the same rules you're talking about apply to that group as well?
Yeah, if you're old enough to be an employee, you're old enough to sign a union card. We've done a number of elections in restaurants and fast food companies, and yeah, you'll have a lot of and it's interesting because it'll come up, right? Hey, this kid's 16. They can't even vote in a federal election. How can you make them vote in this election? But yeah, if you're an employee under the act, you have a right to vote, but you also have a right to sign the card. And so, there's no age limit.
Got it. Okay, let's keep going through. We got a lot of questions, but I want to try to keep them on. I'm going to try to ask them when it's relevant.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, so what changes if a union comes in? I've mentioned this before. I want to just emphasize it real quick. Oh, by the way, before I do that, Franklin, to your point about talking to people early and often, it's a very great strategy to consider, to do some sort of message about these cards during new hire orientation with new team members, especially today when it is really all over TikTok and it's all over. And a lot of people are talking about Starbucks. It's already in the air. To your point, it's a meme now. You may as well just explain, hey, look, you may be approached to sign one of these things. Here's some quick things you need to understand about how these work. You have rights, and we don't want to in any way impair those rights, but you also should take responsibility for yourself to make sure that before you sign something, you understand how it works, and you really, that is how you want to deal with us. So I would highly recommend looking at that. We have videos that are already built to do that, but you can also do something that's kind of real brand specific. But it's a really good idea to just fit that into your orientation program. Okay, exclusive representation. That's a big, legal phrase that just basically means the union becomes the spokesperson for all of the workers that they represent. And it is illegal then for the employer to deal directly with employees around wages, hours, conditions of employment. So even if an employee comes up and says, look, I want to negotiate, I want to raise, and I want to just negotiate with you directly because I've worked here for quite a while and I do more than anyone else here. I want to raise. It's illegal for the employer to have that discussion with that employee directly if they're represented by a union. That has to be negotiated by the union. And unions don't negotiate individual pay raises for people. They negotiate contracts that cover the pay for everybody. That's something a lot of people don't understand. It's also unlawful for the employer to make what's called a unilateral change. The employer no longer can sort of change policies or change things like pay or change benefits once a union is in without negotiating it into a collective bargaining agreement. And it also then changes the relationship. It doesn't prevent an employer from talking to their employees. You still get to, talk to each other. But when it comes to these important subjects of wages, hours, and work conditions, those topics, you can't have any kind of back and forth discussion about. Those are the topics that are subjects of bargaining. That's the main thing that changes when a union comes in. And then let me just use this diagram quickly to illustrate how that works. So today, if you have a non-represented group of workers, this is how it works. If I want to raise, just using the example I just used, I just go to my boss and go, hey, I want to raise. If a union comes in, that line of communication around wages, hours, work conditions is illegal. So that's the X. Instead, the employees will tell the union, this is what I want. The union then will deal with the employer in a negotiation about that subject. And if they can make an agreement, then they reach an agreement and it goes into a contract. If they can't make an agreement, then everything basically just stays the way that it is. That's something that's really frustrating to employees. I can guarantee you there's a lot of frustrated Starbucks workers right now who thought that, look, once the union's voted in, like we're going to just have an agreement and all the things that were told, I was promised that we were going to get when this happened, all that's going to happen automatically. And that's not how it works. It's a lengthy process. Often it can take a year or more. There's a significant number of time that no contracts ever entered. So about a third of the time, there's no agreement ever reached. So that's the thing that changes when a union comes in. The other thing that really changes is the relationship. So a union, and this isn't like, it's not always this way, but I'm just saying sort of typically the way that it works. Typically, it's a more adversarial relationship. And the reason why, and if you just sort of think about, the union is kind of like a politician. Like they are representing constituents. They're representing like a group of workers, right? And they need that group of workers. They want that group of workers to pay them money for that representation. So they need to politic a little bit. They need to be able to make sure people feel like, hey, we're doing a good job for you. Hey, you need us to protect you from this big bad management. Don't go talk to those guys. Just talk to us. We're here to protect you. Like that is sort of the typical way that a union kind of keeps everybody in the fold and gets people to pay them dues money. And because of that, it's very different than the typical relationship that management wants to have with its employees, which is we're all on the same team and we're all trying to do our best to make this a great place to work. A union doesn't really want to do that. In fact, they can sometimes feel like it makes them look weak. Like if they are too cozy with management, now my constituents are going to be mad because they think that like we're in bed with the company. So they need to do whatever they can to kind of make it look. Sometimes it is a super cozy relationship, but they need to make it look like it's not, because they don't want these workers to be mad and kind of like vote them out of office, right? The other thing that changes is contracts tend to be, I would call them like least common denominator. So unions don't like to negotiate sort of like individual promotions or individual pay increases or things like that. They would rather have everything sort of be equal. Not by equal, I don't necessarily mean like, we're going to treat like this group of workers exactly the same as this other group of workers, but it's that we want everything to be structured in a way that like we don't have to make any decisions, and we don't need a bunch of people come to us complaining about the way that this decision was made or that decision was made. We would much prefer to have things based on something like seniority. Now there's no question. I know what date you were hired, so I know like where you are in the pecking order, and I know how this benefit applies to you. Or I don't want anyone working outside of like the classification that they're in. The reason that they want that is, and I don't want like a manager helping. And the reason they want that is because they want the company to be forced to have to hire as many people as possible, and because that helps them make more money. They're not into flexibility that much. So those are things that often change when a union comes in. There's a potential for strikes and walkouts. That's in the news a lot now. And it just really impacts a culture. That adversarial, culture is not really conducive to a great day at work. Unionized workplaces a lot of times have lower, employee satisfaction scores than non-represented ones because of that. Any other questions, or I'll change slides?
I got a couple here. One is, and I think this goes back to what you're saying about Texas being a right to work state. So once there is a union in place, can employees quit the union and maintain employment, just stop paying dues?
Yeah, that's where a lot of people get confused about right to work, and they think of it as at will employment, but right to work only applies to this union stuff. And that's exactly how it works. In a right to work state like Texas, you cannot be forced to be a union member or to pay a union money as a condition of your employment. So you can make that decision, Kelsey, to just say, I'm not paying any dues and I'm not joining the union. Now, those people are put under pressure by other people that are paying dues and are members of the union. They're put under pressure to join, and they'll be called freeloaders. They'll be they're often ostracized because the union wants as many people to join as possible. And for, from their standpoint, they look at it as, well, we're forced to represent you. Like, we shouldn't have to do that for free. You should have to pay us. So that, they will do everything they can to encourage you to pay that money. And like I said, you lose rights when you don't join. So you don't get to vote on your contract. You don't get to run for union office. So there's things you lose when you don't join, but you don't have to. In a right to work state, you don't have to join.
Got it. And then when we're talking about union dues in our industry, any ballpark on what is typically charged?
Yeah, I mean, it varies by union, and frankly, it can vary by even location or local. But a good ballpark is like 1.5% of your monthly wages. So if you think about it like that, for restaurant workers, it's a little harder to, because schedules are so weird. And so you would think more like 1.5% of 40 hours a week worth of work. So as a percentage, lower paid or like part-time workers, they tend to end up paying like a higher percentage of their paycheck in dues than someone who kind of works a normal 40-hour a week, steady job. But yeah, that's typically the way that it is.
Got it. Okay, that's most of the questions now. Folks, keep dropping questions in the Q&A and we'll let Phil keep going.
Yeah. So you're sitting in a restaurant right now that you run, and you're listening to this, you're like, man, I don't want this to happen. What are the kinds of things that make me vulnerable to organizing activity? And these are the factors, these are the main reasons that people will organize a union, or what I would call like trigger points that tend to spark union activity. So the first one is any kind of like major change. I don't like my new boss that just came in, or you implemented this new process. I don't even understand why we're doing it. It's a pain in my butt. I don't like it. That can often lead a group to go like, I want to have so I want to change something around here. I want to have a union. Job insecurity, which a lot of times you think about this labor market, and this is a labor market that's literally unprecedented in my lifetime, which is pretty long time. People do feel pretty safe right now, just going like, well, if you don't let me offer this concert, I'm just going to quit and I'll go get a job next week somewhere else. So there is a little bit of that right now. But if there is this fear that either that I might lose my job, or I don't like the way that I'm getting scheduled, job insecurity isn't just, am I going to keep this particular job, but it's also, do I feel like I have to work 3 jobs in order to fill up to get, to make ends meet. There's a lot of insecurity, that's built into the business model in some cases, right? So like if you're constantly getting cut, then that also feels like job insecurity, even though you still have the job, right? So that can create, that can be a trigger point. Unpopular policy changes, I just really just talked about. Just not involving people in decisions, making changes without talking to people, without explaining it, without asking them what they think. A big one is not addressing issues. A lot of these Starbucks campaigns, when you kind of go back and look at it, is a lot of just sort of day-to-day frustration that was basically being ignored or not handled well. A bad manager is probably the number one trigger of union campaigns. So if you have a manager who treats people bad, who's harsh, who's not approachable, that triggers a lot of campaigns. And then, today, a lot of supervisors actually encourage organizing. Like they, sometimes they are like pushing people to organize. So, managers are often just as frustrated by all the same stuff that Franklin talked about at the very beginning. They're just as frustrated by it as line level employees are. So sometimes they don't feel very connected to the company, don't feel connected to the mission. They'll often encourage organizing. So all of those things are things that you should be paying attention to, just right at your store level, right? Do I explain changes when they're made? Do I make sure to involve people? Do I treat people well? Do I listen to people when they have an issue? Do I address concerns when they come up? All of those things you should really pay close attention to.
And Phil, I'm putting into the chat to a letter that was published in the Houston Chronicle by one of the Starbucks organizers, an employee in Texas, who kind of lays out the list of gripes. That is, a lot of it you can see embodied. You got to strip out some of the rhetoric. There's some rhetoric built in there, but if you look at her complaints, it's a lot of this stuff in this slide. And if you go back to my first slide, it's a lot of that's packed in there. And to your point, there's usually a triggering event. There's this frustration that's built up in the workplace, and then there's usually manager does something or whatever, and it's that triggering event, and it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle after that.
Yeah, and we're just in a totally different world right now. Like all of these issues happen every day in every business, right? In the restaurant business in particular. Okay, 2 years ago, that stuff, no one would ever gone like, you know what? Like, we need a union because of this. Today, the very first thing someone says when one of these things triggers is, this is why we need a union. They don't understand like that a union probably isn't going to solve it or whatever. Like, for example, a bad manager, that's not even a subject of bargaining. If a union asks to like remove a manager, the company can just say, we don't want to talk about that. And that's totally lawful. So there's a lot of things that people think will happen if a union comes in that is just, again, it's kind of mythology. But that doesn't really matter. Like at ground level, you still got a union campaign, and you have employees that wish to be represented because you're not taking care of a knucklehead, assistant manager. So what are the signs that there's organizing activity going on at your location? And I'm not going to read these, but the main point here is the sign is not that card that I showed you earlier. That is like not an early warning sign. If you see a card, you have a campaign afoot, and you're probably really close to being organized. The real signs of a union campaign are these changes in attitude. People act differently than they used to, which are signs that people are frustrated or they don't feel safe and comfortable coming to their manager. Sometimes relationships change. That can be like people that weren't hanging out together now are, or it could be people that used to hang out together are now mad at each other. There's a lot of things that go on in the backdrop of a union campaign that can fray relationships at work. But no one's going to tell you, hey, like, I'm pissed at them because they're trying to force me to sign a card and I don't agree with it. You're just going to see these two people aren't getting along. And that is what you have to be on the lookout for. And then, hey, great news is this doesn't even matter if it's a union issue or not. If you notice this kind of stuff and I call it run to the smoke, but if you like go, hey, like, I noticed like something's going on, what's up? You're going to be seen as a good leader, and you're going to have a much more loyal workforce, and you're going to have a much more productive and happy workforce. You're going to take better care of your guests. Like, a lot of positive things happen if you pay attention to these signs. If you don't pay attention to them, eventually that molehill could turn into the mountain of a organizing campaign. Okay, last couple of slides, and then we can cover any other questions that we have. So what should you be doing today? If you're a restaurant owner or restaurant manager, what do you do now? If you notice these warning signs, if you ever if you see an authorization card, like, get help and get it early. If you don't already know who your labor attorney is, if you had like a situation, or know who you would call for help, whether that's us or anybody else, then you need to get all that figured out, so that you know who to call and you don't have to like wait around. Obviously the Restaurant Association is also a great resource. Franklin's a great resource, but like, figure out who your team is so that you know who it's going to be, like if you need to break glass. So watch what's happening. Franklin already talked about this, but like, if there's a Starbucks in your parking lot that's organizing, you have a big problem. You need to pay super close attention to what's going on in that store. Make sure you're paying attention to those internal factors, those early warning signs I just brought up. And then if you're in a franchise system, or even if you're an independent, make sure that whoever is like the owner of that organization is aware as soon as possible of any of this activity. There's a lot of times people, and like, if let's say you are an independent and you've got like a GM and assistant manager, anytime we ever go into an organizing campaign where like we're helping the company and we've been called in and we're kind of like trying to figure out what's going on, somebody knew what was going on. Like, almost always someone was aware of what was happening. Often they were aware of it for weeks before everything like boiled over, and they didn't say anything. And a lot of times they don't say anything because they're scared like you may kill the messenger. They're scared like this is going to make it look like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what to say. Like, there's a lot of reasons people don't talk about it. It's really important that you should train managers so that they understand this is something that's happening. They understand that there's things that you can do. But most importantly, they understand you want to hear about it, and they're not going to be in trouble because they bring it up. Ideally, they want to understand the only way you're going to get in trouble is if like you knew about it and didn't say anything for weeks. Like, that's a real problem. Giving us an opportunity to kind of get in front of things and solve problems early, that's what we got to do as an organization. So that's kind of the key things you should be doing now. And here's what you should not do. So don't ignore the signs that something's wrong. So that was what I was just talking about. Don't be afraid of raising concerns. I also just mentioned that. Let's go through the spit rules real quick. This is all the law.
Bill,
yeah.
Bill, you're talking to restaurateurs. You got to go with tips and so.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay, we'll call it tips then. Then I have to do it in a different order. But so these are the don'ts, and they're pretty common sense. But so we'll do it in Franklin's order. So there's threat, which is the T. You can't threaten somebody because they are trying to organize a union. If you sign a union card, you're fired. If you support the union, I'm going to change your schedule to be worse. Any kind of negative thing that you might do to somebody as like a punishment for trying to organize. People have a protected right to organize a union. You really need to understand that, like, the way you win these elections is not by trying to threaten or intimidate. Like, it flat out, first of all, it's illegal. On top of that, it doesn't work. The way that you win is you educate people on exactly how this works. And most people, once they kind of understand the way the whole thing works, are like, that's a terrible idea. I am not paying money for that. And I would rather just deal directly with my employer. But you don't threaten people. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that point. And that could be things like reducing hours, cutting shifts, right? Any of that could fall under that illegal activities umbrella, right?
Yes. Anything you do to try to make someone's life uncomfortable because of their exercise of Section 7 rights is illegal. So, don't do that. The I is interrogate. So interrogate is basically, you can't ask people questions to try to figure out which side that they're on, right? You don't ask somebody like who went to the union meeting or who signed a card or anything like that. You can certainly talk to people, and it's not uncommon. People will like volunteer to you, like, hey, I went to the meeting, or hey, I signed a card, or hey, I didn't sign a card. Volunteering that to you you haven't crossed a line there, but don't ask people how they support it. And truly your point of view should be, look, whether you want it or don't want it, that's really not my decision. That's your decision. What's most important to me is that you understand for sure how it works before you make that decision, right? So let's see, what we're going backwards. P is promise. Promise is like the flip side of threats. Okay, I will give you stuff. I will make your life more comfortable. I will give you more shifts. I will give you a raise. I will make your life happier if you just don't exercise your rights under the act. That's all illegal. You can't like bribe people to not join a union. That's also illegal. And then the last one is spy. Spy is basically, you can't sneak around. It's also called surveillance, but you don't go around trying to figure out, like, you can't park your car where the union meeting's being held to see like who else shows up for it. You can't hang out more in the break area than you normally do just to kind of see who's talking to the person that's the organizer. Anything that you're doing to try to unravel activity by surveilling it, that's also unlawful. And then the last thing that you should not do, first of all, make sure that you understand, so don't overreact. Section 7 rights are protected. Don't try to stop people from organizing, just educate them. Like that's the way you have to approach this. Even if you talk about it like in orientation, you want to be clear, like, look, you have a right to do this. What's most important to us is that you understand like how this changes the relationship. And if you decide you want to do it, just understand that it is going to alter the way that we work together. And then the main focus then is connection and understanding. If you focus on those two things, you probably aren't going to have a union problem in the first place. Make sure that your managers are really connected to the team. Make sure that they focus on really trying to understand. I teach these 3 questions. Do you have what you need? What would make work better? And what's next? If you ask those 3 questions on a regular basis to your team, you're not going to have a union problem. You're going to have a really thriving workforce of people that are happy at work. As long as you act on what comes out of those conversations. But those are the things I wanted to cover. So why don't is there any other questions, Kelsey?
Yeah, and if I can pipe in, just weaving a couple questions together real quick. Someone asked a question about Starbucks and where they are in the process. So Starbucks, we have, what's the count? 313 or something that are in the process of organizing into a union. Almost 200, it's like 192-ish that have voted to join the union. So they are in that contract negotiation phase now. They have not negotiated a contract with Starbucks. Starbucks seems pretty intent on not making that process easy, which makes sense, and drawing out that process. And I think the union's going to have a tough time getting everyone on the same page. And what are the 4 things that they want to get out of a contract? Because each one of these units is organized around different things that they want. So, a question that's often asked, is this Starbucks thing like a flash in the pan, or does it have staying power, and is this going to redefine the labor movement? And I think those are all really good questions that none of us honestly have great answers to, other than we're going to have to wait and see. I think a lot of it's going to come down to, can they get something out of the employer through this negotiation process? But we'll see. We'll see if they can turn this into success. So one of the other questions, Phil, and you kind of touched on this, after the contract negotiation or after the bargaining process, you get a contract, and then you hit on, that 2-3 year period, whatever the contract is, then you can vote out the union. So someone specifically asked about the decertification process and what that looks like once you get a union in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So decertification is just how you get rid of a union. And it works basically like the certification process. So there has to be proof that at least 30% of a group of represented workers no longer wish to be represented. That is often done on a petition. But anyway, they fill that out and they're like, we no longer wish to be represented. Once that's done, they then can go to the National Labor Relations Board and ask for an election. And then you basically have the same thing that you would have on a certification side. You'd have a vote over whether or not the decertification is going to occur, whether or not these employees wish to remain represented by a union. And then if a majority of those workers don't vote for representation, or if a majority of them vote in favor of decertifying, then the union is no longer there. You're restricted from doing it. You can't do it during the first 3 years of a labor agreement. There's a 30-day window that opens up towards the end of that contract that you can do it. But other than that, during the 3 years of a contract, you can't do it. If a contract lasts more than 3 years, anytime after the end of that third year, so 4 on, you can file for decertification. If the contract ever expires for any reason, then you can file for decertification there. But that's basically how that process
works. And once you file for decertification, say you lose, is there then a cooling off period? There's a period after which you cannot refile for another decertification vote?
Well, if you lose, then the union remains the representative, and so you have the bargaining obligation and so on. If, let's just say, the employees vote to remain represented, but no contract is entered for, let's say, another year, there is a 1 year, what's called an election bar. So you can't hold another election for a year in that group. But then if another decert petition was filed, at year 1 plus 1 day, then you could have another election for decertification at that point.
You want to stay away from having to ever deal with decertification, though.
It's difficult to do. And of course, unions don't like it when employees try to get rid of them. So the same way you get put under a lot of pressure if you don't join, you get put under tons of pressure if you try to, get them voted out.
Got it. Well, we are over time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We got through a ton of questions. Loved the amount of engagement today. So
Leslie or Kelsey, I'm sorry. There's only one question left.
Okay, we'll get, yes.
Okay, when it comes to contracts, does an entire new handbook have to be written? All that happens is your handbook stays in place, but if you agree to things that are different than your handbook, then the contract is what governs. So you don't have to rewrite another handbook, although if you've agreed to something different in your contract, you might go change your handbook, but it's basically, it kind of creates like an addendum to the handbook or a new handbook. Okay. Thank you.
Love the commitment there. No man left behind.
Exactly.
I think the key thing I really want to emphasize is that SPIT acronym. Union and organizing is a little bit of a new thing for many of us in Texas. And so don't just assume that you can do something because we're in Texas and it's a right to work state, right? I think what Phil said about recognizing employees have rights in this space, and we certainly don't want to run afoul of those, is really important. So if you have questions, please make sure you're reaching out to us, you're reaching out to Phil, Franklin, other experts in this field, because we certainly want to make sure that we are doing things by the book. That's the lawyer in me. That's the speech for the day. But thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. We will share this webinar on our YouTube page. We post all of our webinars there. So, check in often and make sure you're up to speed on all the latest. And thank you again to Phil and Franklin for a really helpful and informative panel today.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was great. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.